Hyunwoo Kim stood in the massive chamber of the Galactic Council and felt his heart sink as the numbers appeared on the crystal display above him. The vote was clear and brutal. Proposal 4471B had been rejected by a margin of 812 votes to 43. His proposal for equal human representation in the council had not even been given a proper debate. The alien delegates had dismissed it with the same casual indifference they might show to a request for better lighting in the bathrooms. The Velkari delegate made a series of clicking sounds that the translation device in Hyunwoo's ear converted to words dripping with condescension. "The young species from Sol 3 must understand their place in our ancient civilization," she said while her four arms gestured dismissively. "They have been among the stars for barely 500 rotations, while some of us have traveled between worlds for tens of thousands of years. Patience is required for such an immature race." Hyunwoo's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but his face remained calm. He had been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 8 years and had heard these same words in dozens of different languages from hundreds of different species. Too young, too violent, too unpredictable, too human. The excuses never changed, and neither did the result. From her position in the observation gallery above the main floor, Dr. So-Young Park watched the proceedings with growing anger. She had come to Nexus Prime as part of the human diplomatic mission and had spent months preparing detailed reports about human contributions to galactic society. Her research showed that humans made up less than 2% of the Council's membership, but handled nearly 30% of all dangerous missions. Human ships carried medicine to plague worlds that other species were too afraid to approach. Human engineers repaired space stations in the middle of radiation storms. Human soldiers kept peace in sectors where even the most advanced military forces refused to patrol. The irony was not lost on her. The same qualities that the Council used to justify excluding humans were the exact qualities that kept their civilization running. When the Nexari colony ships had been trapped in a collapsing star system, it was Captain Sung-Ho Park who had flown his crew through a field of solar flares to rescue 3,000 civilians. When the Zephyrian homeworld had been hit by a plague that killed anyone who came near the infected zones, it was Dr. Hae-Won Lee who had walked into the contaminated cities and found a cure. When pirates had taken over the trade routes near the Broken Reach, it was Admiral Mi-Young Choi who had hunted them down through asteroid fields that no other pilot would enter. The council chambers were a marvel of alien architecture that rose nearly a kilometer into the artificial sky of Nexus Prime. Representatives from over 2,000 species filled the curved seating areas that spiraled around the central speaking platform. The air itself was carefully controlled to support dozens of different atmospheric requirements, and the gravity was kept at exactly 70% of Earth normal to accommodate the widest possible range of physiologies. Everything about the place was designed to show the unity and cooperation of galactic civilization, everything except the treatment of humans. Hyunwoo stepped up to the speaking platform for what he knew would be the last time. The translation matrix hummed to life around him, and his words were instantly converted into the native languages of every species present. He looked up at the thousands of alien faces staring down at him and felt a strange sense of freedom. He no longer needed to be diplomatic. He no longer needed to carefully phrase his words to avoid giving offense. He was about to burn every bridge he had spent 8 years building, and he found that the prospect made him smile. "Honored delegates," he began in a voice that carried clearly through the vast chamber. "For 8 years I have stood before you, asking for nothing more than what you have given to species with far less experience and far fewer contributions to our shared civilization. Today marks the end of those requests." A ripple of confusion passed through the assembled delegates. This was not how diplomatic speeches usually began. The Arcteran representative's translator made a sound like grinding metal that indicated puzzlement, while the Nexari delegate's crest flattened against his skull in what humans had learned was a sign of concern. "Earth has been a member of this council for over 2 centuries, Hyunwoo continued. "In that time, we have saved more lives, rescued more civilians, and solved more crises than any 10 other species combined. We have asked for nothing in return except the respect that any civilized being deserves. Today, you have made it clear that such respect will never be given freely?" So-Young felt her pulse quicken as she realized what was happening. Hyunwoo was not making another plea for inclusion. He was saying goodbye. "Therefore," Hyunwoo said as his voice grew stronger, I am here to inform this assembly that humanity is withdrawing from all Galactic Council agreements, treaties, and protections effective immediately. We will no longer serve as your emergency. Responders, your dangerous mission specialists, or your convenient solution to problems you are too civilized to handle yourselves. The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates jumped to their feet, making sounds of outrage, confusion, and panic in dozens of different languages. The Velkari representative, who had dismissed the human proposal just minutes earlier, was now frantically gesturing for recognition to speak. The massive Thorgani delegate, whose species had colonized space for over 50,000 years, was making deep rumbling sounds that the translators could not process. Even the ancient ethereals, who rarely showed emotion of any kind, were glowing with colors that indicated severe distress. But Hyun-woo was not finished. He waited for the noise to die down before delivering his final words. You have taught us that we are not welcome in your ancient civilization. We accept this lesson and we thank you for it. You will discover in the coming months exactly what our contributions were worth. We wish you well in your endeavors. He turned and walked away from the speaking platform without waiting for permission to leave or for any response from the assembly. So Young met him at the exit, and together they made their way through corridors filled with panicking council staff and confused alien officials who were already trying to process what had just happened. Aboard the human diplomatic vessel, Souls, Pride Hyun-woo activated the quantum communication array and sent a single encrypted message to Earth. Fleet Admiral Ji-hoon Lee received the transmission in his office at Terran Command and immediately understood its meaning. Protocol Severance had been developed years earlier as a contingency plan that most people had hoped would never be needed. It was a complete withdrawal of all human personnel and resources from Council space, followed by a total communication blackout. Within 6 hours, every human ship station and settlement had received the same message. Effective immediately, humanity withdraws from all Galactic Council agreements, treaties, and protections. We stand alone. The message was accompanied by detailed instructions for immediate evacuation of all Council territory and the recall of all human personnel regardless of their current assignments. Captain Dong-hyun Kim was hauling medical supplies to his Etherian colony when he received the order. He immediately changed course and began the journey back to human space. Dr. Young-mi Park was in the middle of performing surgery on a Nexari diplomat when her communicator buzzed with the recall notice. She finished the operation, then packed her equipment and left without explanation. Engineer Woo-jin Lee was halfway through repairing a critical hyperspace relay when the message came through. He powered down his tools, gathered his team, and departed, leaving the half-completed work floating in space. All across the galaxy, the same scene played out thousands of times. Humans simply stopped what they were doing and left. There were no arguments, no negotiations, and no explanations beyond the simple statement that Earth had severed all ties with the Galactic Council. Ships changed course mid-journey. Research projects were abandoned. Security details walked away from their posts. Medical teams left hospitals. Engineers stepped away from critical repairs. By the end of the week, nearly every human in Council space was gone, and those who remained were making preparations to leave. The great experiment in galactic cooperation that had lasted for centuries was over, and humanity had chosen isolation over integration. The galaxy would soon learn what it meant to function without the species they had deemed too young and too dangerous to deserve respect. 3 months had passed since humanity vanished from galactic civilization, and the first cracks were beginning to show. Yoon-ji Song had been the trade commissioner for the Terran Commercial Guild, and her quiet efficiency had made her nearly invisible to most alien officials. They had seen her as just another minor bureaucrat managing shipping schedules and cargo manifests. What they had not realized was that she controlled the movement of goods across half the galaxy. The humans had never made a big show of their commercial operations. They simply did the work that others found too difficult or too dangerous. Human cargo ships flew through asteroid fields that other pilots considered impassable. Human traders ventured into sectors where pirates and raiders made regular shipping impossible. Human merchants had built relationships with isolated colonies that the major trading houses had written off as unprofitable. When Yoon-ji recalled every human vessel, the effect was immediate, but not obvious. At first it seemed like a minor inconvenience. A few shipments were delayed. Some delivery schedules had to be adjusted. A handful of routes became temporarily unavailable. The council bureaucrats issued standard statements about temporary disruptions and assured everyone that alternative arrangements were being made. The Zephyrians were the first to realize the true scope of the problem. Their homeworld was a paradise of crystal cities and floating gardens, but it could not feed its population of 12 billion. For over a century, they had depended on food shipments from agricultural worlds in distant sectors. The route between Zephyria and its primary suppliers led through the Maelstrom Nebula, where radiation storms and gravitational anomalies made navigation extremely hazardous. Captain Minho Choi had been flying that route for 15 years. His ship, the Busan's Dream, was specially modified with shielding and navigation systems that could handle the nebula's dangers. More importantly, Minho himself had the kind of intuitive understanding of space navigation that allowed him to find safe passage through conditions that would destroy other vessels. The Zephyrians had tried to hire him exclusively many times, but he had always refused, preferring to maintain his independence. Now Minho was gone, and with him went the only reliable way to transport food to Zephyria. The council tried to find replacement ships and pilots, but every attempt ended in disaster. 3 vessels were lost to radiation storms in the first week. 2 more were torn apart by gravitational shears when their pilots tried to follow outdated navigation charts. The surviving crews refused to make further attempts, and the food shipments stopped completely. The Outer Rim territories faced a different but equally serious crisis. The hyperspace relay network that connected the frontier colonies to the rest of galactic civilization was a marvel of engineering that required constant maintenance and repair. The relays themselves were built from Nexari crystal technology and Arcteran quantum processors, but the systems that kept them running were primarily human innovations. Engineer Tai-Min Yoon and his maintenance crews had spent years developing techniques for repairing relays in deep space. The work was incredibly dangerous because relay stations were often located near pulsars, black holes, and other stellar phenomena that provided the energy needed for hyperspace transmission. The radiation levels around most relay stations would kill unprotected beings in minutes, and the gravitational effects could tear apart any ship that approached without proper preparation. Humans had proven uniquely suited to this work because they seemed to have an unusual tolerance for environmental extremes and a willingness to take calculated risks that other species found incomprehensible. Taemin himself had once repaired a critical relay while his ship was being pulled toward a black hole. He had completed the work with only seconds to spare before the gravitational field would have made escape impossible. When Taemin and his crews vanished, the relay network began to fail. The automated systems could handle routine maintenance, but major repairs required the kind of creative problem-solving that humans excelled at. One by one, the relay stations went dark. Communication between the Outer Rim colonies and the galactic core was reduced to subspace messages that took weeks or months to travel between star systems. On Arcturus Station, Dr. Haijin Kwan had been leading the most advanced xenological research in the galaxy. Her team of human scientists had made breakthrough discoveries in cross-species medicine that were saving lives across dozens of different civilizations. The work was painstaking and often dangerous because it required researchers to expose themselves to alien pathogens and biological agents that could be lethal to humans. Haijin's greatest achievement had been the development of universal antiviral treatments that could be modified to work on any known species. Her research had ended plagues that had threatened to wipe out entire civilizations, and her techniques were being used in hospitals throughout Council space. The Galactic Health Consortium had based its entire emergency response protocol on her work. When Haijin and her team departed, they took with them not just their expertise, but also their ongoing research. The projects they abandoned were too complex for other scientists to continue. Alien researchers who tried to replicate human techniques found that they lacked the intuitive understanding of biological systems that seemed to come naturally to humans. Critical research ground to a halt, and new medical emergencies began to appear with no one qualified to address them. The pattern repeated itself across the galaxy. Human pilots who had been the only ones willing to fly rescue missions through solar storms were gone. Human engineers who maintained mining operations in extreme environments had vanished. Human soldiers who kept peace in the lawless sectors had disappeared. Human scientists who studied the most dangerous phenomena in the universe had departed. The Galactic Council tried to downplay the significance of these departures. Official statements spoke of minor logistical challenges and temporary service interruptions. Council bureaucrats assured member species that alternative solutions were being developed and that the situation would be resolved quickly. Behind closed doors, however, panic was beginning to set in. The Nexari Consortium, which controlled much of the galaxy's banking and finance sector, was the first to publicly acknowledge the crisis. Their quarterly report noted significant disruptions to interstellar commerce and warned of potential economic instability if shipping routes could not be restored. The report carefully avoided mentioning humans by name, but its implications were clear to anyone who understood galactic trade patterns. Other organizations began to issue similar warnings. The Miners Guild reported that production was down 30% due to the inability to maintain equipment in hazardous environments. The Explorers Society announced that deep space surveys were being suspended indefinitely because no one was willing to investigate dangerous stellar phenomena. The Peacekeeping Alliance admitted that they had lost control of 6 different sectors where human security forces had been the primary law enforcement. On Nexus Prime, the council chambers that had once buzzed with confident discussion of galactic affairs now echoed with worried whispers and urgent conferences. Delegates who had dismissed humanity's importance just months earlier were now frantically trying to understand how their civilization had become so dependent on a species they had considered inferior. The Velkari representative who had led the opposition to human membership was among the most vocal in demanding action. Her clicking speech had lost its condescending tone and taken on notes of genuine fear as she described the collapse of shipping routes that her people depended on for survival. The massive Thorgani delegate, whose species had ruled vast sectors of space for millennia, admitted that they could not maintain their territory without human assistance. Even the ancient ethereals, who had existed since before most current species had evolved, began to show signs of concern. Their glowing forms pulsed with colors that indicated deep contemplation as they tried to calculate the long-term consequences of humanity's departure. For beings who thought in terms of geological timescales, the rapid deterioration of galactic civilization was deeply disturbing. The Council formed emergency committees to address each crisis, but every proposed solution ran into the same fundamental problem. The work that humans had been doing was not just difficult or dangerous, but required a combination of skills and attitudes that seemed uniquely human. Other species could learn the technical aspects of piloting through asteroid fields or repairing hyperspace relays, but they could not replicate the human willingness to take enormous risks for uncertain rewards. Attempts to hire private contractors to replace human services failed repeatedly. The few non-human pilots who attempted to navigate the Maelstrom Nebula either turned back after minor equipment failures or were lost entirely. Engineering teams that tried to repair relay stations in extreme environments spent so much time on safety precautions that simple maintenance tasks took weeks instead of hours. Medical researchers who tried to continue human projects made little progress because they lacked the intuitive leaps of logic that had driven human discoveries. As the months passed, it became clear that the galaxy was facing not just a temporary shortage of services, but a fundamental breakdown of the systems that held interstellar civilization. 6 months after humanity's departure from galactic civilization, the first major crisis struck like a hammer blow to an already weakened structure. The Malachi Consortium had been watching and waiting as trade routes collapsed and security forces withdrew from frontier sectors. They were not a species, but rather a loose alliance of pirates, raiders, and mercenaries drawn from dozens of different civilizations. For centuries, they had been contained by the combined forces of the Galactic Council, but now they sensed weakness and moved to exploit it. Colonel Da-Yun Park stood in the command center of Terran Defense Station 7, monitoring communication, channels that carried desperate pleas for help from across the galaxy. The screens around her displayed tactical information about 6 simultaneous attacks on Council worlds. The Malachi had chosen their targets carefully, striking at colonies that were isolated, vulnerable, and strategically important. Without human peacekeeping forces to respond quickly, the attacks were proceeding without resistance. The first target was New Zephyria, a crystal farming colony that supplied rare materials needed for hyperspace communication systems. The colonists had barely managed to send a distress signal before Malachi raiders overwhelmed their defenses. The second attack hit a Nexari research station where scientists were developing new medical technologies. The third struck a mining operation that provided essential metals for starship construction. Each target was chosen to maximize both immediate profit and long-term damage to galactic infrastructure. Da-Yun watched the tactical displays with professional interest, but no intention of intervening. Her orders were clear and absolute. Earth had withdrawn from all Council agreements, and that withdrawal included any obligation to protect Council citizens from external threats. The humans who had once served as the galaxy's first line of defense were now simply observers watching their former protectorates fall to enemies they had once held in check. The Council's own military forces proved woefully inadequate when faced with real combat. The Peacekeeping Alliance had been designed primarily for ceremonial duties and minor disputes between member species. Their ships were beautiful works of art equipped with advanced defensive systems and non-lethal weapons meant to discourage rather than destroy. Their crews were trained in negotiation and conflict resolution, not the brutal realities of warfare against enemies who had no interest in diplomatic solutions. When the Alliance fleet finally responded to the Malachi attacks, they were systematically destroyed. The elegant Council vessels with their gleaming hulls and sophisticated technology were no match for the crude but effective warships of the consortium. Malachi raiders had learned their trade in the harsh realities of frontier warfare where survival depended on firepower mobility and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. The Battle of New Zephyria lasted less than 4 hours. 12 Council ships faced 30 Malachi raiders in what should have been an even fight given the superior technology of the Alliance vessels. Instead, it became a massacre as the Council commanders tried to follow engagement protocols that assumed their enemies would respect the laws of civilized warfare. The Malachi had no such constraints and used every dirty trick in the book, including fake surrender signals, booby-trapped escape pods, and attacks on medical vessels. In the aftermath of the battle, the surviving Council officers filed reports that painted a stark picture of their own inadequacy. Commander Velthara of the Nexari Second Fleet wrote, "The enemy showed no regard for the established conventions of interstellar conflict. They targeted our command structures, disabled our communications, and refused to accept surrender. Our crew training emphasized minimal casualties and peaceful resolution, but the Malachi appeared to view our restraint as weakness to be exploited. The pattern repeated itself across all 6 battlefields. Council forces that had maintained peace for generations through the threat of overwhelming technological superiority discovered that technology alone was not enough when facing enemies who understood how to fight dirty. The sophisticated defensive systems that protected against precise targeted attacks were vulnerable to crude weapons used in unexpected ways. The non-lethal weapons that had proven effective against civilized opponents were useless against raiders who felt no obligation to follow the rules. On Earth, President Sang-Hoon Kim addressed the Terran Parliament in a session that was broadcast throughout human space, but nowhere else. The galaxy had cut itself off from human communication networks and was no longer receiving their transmissions. Kim's words were meant for human ears alone as he explained the reasoning behind their continued isolation. 6 months ago, we were told that humanity was too violent and too unpredictable for membership in galactic civilization, Kim said, as he stood before the assembled representatives of Earth's government. Today, that violence and unpredictability is exactly what the galaxy needs to survive, but they can no longer call upon it. They made their choice when they rejected our partnership, and now they must live with the consequences of that decision. The President's speech was interrupted by reports of new Malachi attacks. The consortium had expanded their operations beyond simple raiding and was now attempting to establish permanent control over conquered territories. They had learned that the Council lacked both the military capability and the political will to mount effective resistance. What had begun as opportunistic strikes was evolving into a systematic campaign of conquest. Meanwhile, in the Omega sector, Chief Navigator Yu Jin Han was leading humanity's largest colonial expedition into regions of space that the Council had declared too dangerous for exploration. The Terra Nova fleet consisted of 300 ships carrying over 2 million colonists, along with the equipment and supplies needed to establish a completely independent human civilization. The Omega sector was indeed dangerous, but it was dangerous in ways that humans had learned to handle. Unstable stars created radiation fields that required constant monitoring and adjustment of flight paths. Gravitational anomalies made traditional navigation impossible and demanded the kind of intuitive piloting that humans had mastered. Hostile alien species controlled key systems and had to be either negotiated with or fought depending on their intentions. What the Council had seen as insurmountable obstacles, humans viewed as interesting challenges. Captain Kyung-ho Lee led scouting missions through electromagnetic storms that would have disabled any other species' equipment. Dr. Jin-Woo Park established research stations near neutron stars to study exotic matter formations. Engineer Hae-Young Kim designed orbital habitats that could survive the gravitational stress of binary star systems. The real breakthrough came when Dr. Ki-Young Lee announced the completion of humanity's independent faster-than-light communication network. The technology was based on quantum entanglement principles that human scientists had been developing in secret for decades. Unlike the crystal-based systems used by the Council, the human network was faster, more reliable, and completely independent of galactic infrastructure. The new FTL network changed everything. Earth was no longer isolated but had become the center of a rapidly expanding web of human colonies and outposts that stretched across previously unexplored regions of space. While the galaxy struggled with communication delays and failing relay stations, humans were establishing real-time links between worlds separated by thousands of light-years. The psychological impact of this achievement was enormous. Humans had not only survived their exile from galactic civilization, but had exceeded it in the areas where they had been considered most efficient. The species that had been dismissed as too primitive for full Council membership had developed technology that surpassed anything the ancient civilizations possessed. News of human expansion reached the galaxy through smugglers and independent traders who operated outside Council jurisdiction. Reports spoke of vast human fleets moving through sectors that had been considered impassable. Human colonies were being established on worlds that the Council had written off as uninhabitable. Human technology was advancing at a pace that seemed impossible for such a young species. The most disturbing reports described human military capabilities. The same individuals who had once served as peacekeepers for the Council were now defending human space with weapons and tactics that no galactic force could match. Human warships were faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed than anything in the Council fleet. Human soldiers fought with a combination of high technology and primitive savagery that terrified enemies who had grown accustomed to civilized warfare. But perhaps most significant was the attitude of the human colonists themselves. They showed no interest in rejoining galactic civilization or seeking approval from the Council. They were building something entirely new and independent. They had moved beyond the need for external validation and were creating their own definition of what advanced civilization should look like. Back in Council space, the situation continued to deteriorate. The Malachi had captured 18 worlds and showed no signs of slowing their advance. Trade had collapsed to levels not seen in centuries. Medical research had stagnated without human expertise. The relay network was failing faster than repairs could be made with traditional methods. 1 year after humanity severed ties with the Galactic Council, the situation had moved beyond crisis into complete breakdown. High Counselor Vexathara stood before the Great Assembly Hall and looked out at seats that were increasingly empty as member species withdrew from galactic affairs to protect their own territories. The elegant chamber that had once hosted debates about philosophy, art, and the peaceful expansion of civilization now echoed with desperate discussions about survival. Tiamai, numbers were staggering and undeniable. The Malachi Consortium had conquered 18 major worlds and countless smaller colonies. Trade volume had dropped by 70% as shipping routes became too dangerous to traverse. Medical emergencies that should have been routine were becoming catastrophic because the expertise to handle them no longer existed. The hyperspace relay network was operating at less than 30% capacity, and failing components were being replaced faster than new ones could be manufactured. But the statistics only told part of the story. The real damage was to the confidence and unity that had held galactic civilization together for millennia. Species that had cooperated for centuries were now viewing each other with suspicion and fear. Ancient alliances were dissolving as former. Partners competed for the limited resources and protection that remained available. The careful balance of power that had maintained peace was crumbling as each civilization tried to secure its own survival. Counselor Thindar of the Velkari was among the first to speak the words that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to admit. Her four arms gestured frantically as she addressed the assembly with the same clicking sounds that had once dismissed human requests for equality. Now those sounds carried desperation instead of condescension, as she explained the reality that her people faced. "We must acknowledge our error," she said, while her translator converted her words into dozens of languages. "The humans were not the problem we believed them to be, but rather the solution to problems we did not understand we had. Our pride has cost us more than our dignity. It has cost us our civilization itself." The admission sent ripples of shock through the chamber. The Velkari had been among the most vocal opponents of human membership, and had led the faction that viewed humans as too primitive for civilized society. For their representative to now advocate for human return was a clear sign of how desperate the situation had become. Other delegates began to voice similar sentiments. The Arctarian representative, whose species had controlled interstellar banking for thousands of years, spoke about economic collapse and the need to restore human-operated trade routes. The Zephyrian delegate described population centers that were facing starvation because food shipments could no longer reach them safely. The Nexari delegate talked about research projects that had been abandoned and medical breakthroughs that were no longer possible without human expertise. But not everyone was ready to admit defeat. Commander Brixtal of the Thorgani military spoke with the deep, rumbling voice that commanded respect throughout the galaxy. His species had built an empire that spanned dozens of star systems and had never shown weakness to any enemy. The idea of crawling back to humans and begging for their return was deeply offensive to everything the Thorgani represented. "If we grovel before these upstart mammals now, we will never regain our authority," he declared, while his massive form dominated the speaking platform. "Yes, we face challenges, but we have survived worse in our long history. We must find our own solutions rather than surrendering our dignity to beings who have existed in space for the briefest moment of cosmic time." The debate that followed was fierce and sometimes bitter. Delegates who had worked together for decades found themselves on opposite sides of fundamental questions about the nature of leadership and the price of survival. Some argued that swallowing their pride was a small cost to pay for the restoration of galactic stability. Others insisted that acknowledging human superiority would destroy the very foundations of the civilization they were trying to save. The discussion was interrupted by an unexpected transmission from Earth. Ambassador Yeon Su Choi appeared as a holographic projection in the center of the chamber. She had replaced Hyunwoo Kim as humanity's representative to the galaxy, though she no longer held any official position since Earth had withdrawn from all council agreements. Her presence was the first direct communication between humans and the council since the severance a year earlier. Yeonsu's message was brief and devastating in its simplicity. She spoke in the calm, professional tone that had once been standard for diplomatic communications, but her words carried the weight of absolute finality. "The Galactic Council has requested the opportunity to discuss humanity's return to galactic civilization," she said while her image flickered slightly due to transmission delays. "Earth has considered this request and determined that the previous relationship was fundamentally flawed and cannot be restored." The silence that followed. Her statement was absolute. Thousands of alien delegates sat frozen as they processed the implications of what they had just heard. The humans were not simply playing hard to get or trying to negotiate better terms. They had moved beyond the need for galactic approval and were rejecting the entire framework of Council civilization. But Yeon-su was not finished. Her next words would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy in ways that no one could have anticipated. However, Earth recognizes that many species are facing genuine crises that threaten their survival and the stability of interstellar civilization. We are therefore prepared to consider new arrangements that reflect the current reality of galactic affairs. The terms that followed were unlike anything in the history of interstellar relations. Humanity demanded full council membership with permanent seats and veto power over all major decisions. They required exclusive rights to the Omega Sector and formal recognition of human territorial sovereignty throughout their expanding colonial empire. Most shocking of all, they insisted on the right to establish human protection zones around any species that requested their security services. The implications were staggering. Humanity was not asking to return to their previous position as junior members of galactic civilization. They were demanding recognition as the dominant force in interstellar affairs with authority that exceeded even the most ancient and powerful species. The protective zones would essentially create a parallel government structure that could override council decisions in any territory where humans provided security services. The debate that erupted after Yan Su's transmission made the previous arguments seem mild by comparison. Delegates who had been willing to consider human return as equal partners were appalled by demands that would make humans the de facto rulers of galactic civilization. The Thorgani representative declared the terms utterly unacceptable and called for immediate military action against human territory. The ethereal delegate, whose species had existed since before most current civilizations had evolved, expressed profound concern about the precedent that capitulating to human demands would establish. But other voices spoke with equal passion about the alternatives to accepting human terms. The Zephyrian delegate reminded the assembly that her people were literally starving while the council debated matters of pride and precedent. The mining guild representative pointed out that industrial production had collapsed to levels that threatened the technological basis of galactic civilization. The medical consortium representative described plagues that were spreading unchecked because the expertise to contain them no longer existed. As the debate raged through the night, it became clear that the council faced an impossible choice. Accepting human terms would fundamentally alter the balance of galactic power and reduce ancient civilizations to client states dependent on human protection. Rejecting those terms would mean accepting the continued collapse of interstellar society and the possibility that many species might not survive the crises they faced. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. The margin was narrow enough that individual delegates could feel the weight of their decision on the future of galactic civilization. In the end, pragmatism won over pride, but barely. The council voted to accept humanity's terms by a margin of just 37 votes out of over 2,000 cast. The aftermath of the vote was immediate and dramatic. Several major species, including the Thorgani, announced their withdrawal from the council rather than accept human authority. Other civilizations that had abstained from the vote began making direct contact with Earth to negotiate their own protection agreements outside the council framework. The galaxy was splitting into factions based on their willingness to accept the new reality of human dominance. On Earth, President Sang-Hoon Kim received the news of the council's acceptance with satisfaction but little surprise. The humans had never doubted that desperation would eventually overcome alien pride. The only question had been how much damage would be done to galactic civilization before that realization occurred. The price of that pride was now visible across the galaxy. 18 worlds remained under Malachi control because the Council had lacked the military capability to retake them. 2 years after humanity severed ties with the Galactic Council, Admiral Subin Park stood on the bridge of the flagship Incheon Rising as it entered orbit around Nexus Prime. The massive vessel was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before combining human engineering innovation with technologies recovered from the Omega Sector. Its sleek hull bristled with weapons systems that made even the most advanced council ships look primitive by comparison. Below on the planet's surface, the restored Galactic Council chambers bore visible signs of the changes that had swept through galactic civilization. The elegant architecture remained the same, but new additions had been constructed to accommodate humanity's requirements. At the very center of the Great Assembly Hall, a cluster of seats designated specifically for human representatives now dominated the speaking platform that had once been shared equally among all member species. The symbolism was unmistakable and intentional. Humanity had not simply returned to take their previous place in galactic society, but had reshaped that society to reflect new realities of power and influence. The species that had once been dismissed as too young and too violent to deserve respect now sat at the literal and figurative center of interstellar governance. Chancellor Boram Song represented humanity as their first supreme representative to the reformed Galactic Council. The title itself was new, created specifically to acknowledge humanity's unique status as both members and protectors of galactic civilization. Boram carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that her words could reshape the fate of entire star systems. The chamber was fuller than it had been in months, as species that had withdrawn during the chaos began to return, seeking protection and stability that only humans could provide. The Zephyrians had been among the first to request admission to a human protection zone after their food supply crisis had been resolved within weeks of human intervention. The mining guilds had followed after human engineers restored industrial production to pre-crisis levels in record time. But the most significant change was visible in the attitudes and behavior of the alien delegates themselves. The condescension and casual dismissal that had characterized their treatment of humans were completely gone, replaced by careful respect and sometimes barely concealed fear. These were beings who had learned through harsh experience that humanity's patience had limits, and that crossing those limits carried consequences that could last for generations. Boram rose to address the assembly, and the great chamber fell silent with a completeness that had never been achieved during the old council sessions. When humans spoke now, the galaxy listened because they had learned that human words carried the weight of actions that could reshape civilization itself. 2 years ago, this assembly rejected humanity's request for equal partnership in galactic governance. Boram began while her words were instantly translated into hundreds of languages. Today we gather not as supplicants seeking acceptance, but as the architects of a new order that recognizes the true foundations of civilized society. Her speech was interrupted by the arrival of data feeds showing the current state of galactic affairs. The contrast with the situation 2 years earlier was dramatic and undeniable. Trade volumes had not only recovered, but exceeded pre-crisis levels as human-protected shipping routes proved more reliable and efficient than anything the galaxy had known before. Medical research was advancing at unprecedented rates as human scientists shared their techniques with carefully selected partners. Most impressive of all was the security situation. The Malachi Consortium that had once seemed unstoppable had been systematically destroyed by human military forces that operated with the efficiency and ruthlessness that shocked even veteran observers. The 18 worlds that had been under Malachi control were not only liberated, but had become some of the most prosperous and secure territories in the galaxy under human protection. Dr. Jin-Ho Park now served as head of the Galactic Innovation Council, a new organization that coordinated research and development across all member species. His latest announcement demonstrated the scope of humanity's technological advancement during their 2 years of isolation. The terraforming technology he unveiled could transform dead worlds into garden paradises in a fraction of the time required by traditional methods. What made the announcement truly remarkable was humanity's decision to share this technology freely, with all species regardless of their previous attitudes toward humans. The terraforming blueprints were transmitted to every member world without restrictions or licensing fees. It was a gesture that demonstrated both humanity's technical superiority and their commitment to the welfare of galactic civilization as a whole. The psychological impact of this generosity was enormous. Species that had spent months debating whether to accept human protection were suddenly competing to attract human settlers and advisors to their territories. The human protection zones that had initially been viewed as surrenders of sovereignty were now seen as privileges that brought security, prosperity, and access to advanced technologies. The transformation was visible everywhere. Arctarian banks that had once refused to deal with human traders were now offering preferential terms to attract human business. Nexari research institutes that had dismissed human scientists were desperately trying to recruit human researchers. Even the proud Thorgani who had withdrawn from the council rather than accept human authority were quietly opening diplomatic channels to discuss possible cooperation agreements. But perhaps the most significant change was in the fundamental assumptions that governed galactic civilization. The old order had been based on the belief that advanced technology and ancient wisdom were the primary qualifications for leadership. The new order recognized that survival in a hostile universe required qualities that could not be measured by conventional standards. Human willingness to take enormous risks for uncertain rewards was no longer seen as a character flaw, but as an essential capability that enabled progress and innovation. Human tolerance for danger and discomfort was recognized as what made it possible to explore unknown regions and develop new territories. Human adaptability and problem-solving skills were acknowledged as the foundation of technological advancement and crisis response. The species that had once looked down on humanity for these very qualities now understood that they were the characteristics that separated thriving civilizations from extinct ones. The galaxy had learned that survival was not about avoiding danger, but about having the courage and capability to face it when necessary. The human protection zones had become more than security arrangements. They were laboratories for new forms of interspecies cooperation that combined human leadership with alien expertise. Zephyrian crystal technology enhanced human manufacturing processes. Nexari biological research accelerated human medical discoveries. Arcturan financial systems enabled human trade networks to operate on scales that had never been possible before. But the cooperation was not between equals. Humanity's position as the dominant partner was never in doubt and was reinforced daily by demonstrations of human capability that no other species could match. When the Vorthon Empire attempted to challenge human authority in the Outer Rim, the response was swift and decisive. A single human battle group destroyed the Vorthon fleet so completely that other potential challengers immediately abandoned any thoughts of resistance. The message was clear and unmistakable. Humanity was not interested in ruling through fear or oppression, but they would not tolerate challenges to the order they had created. Species that accepted human leadership and contributed to galactic stability would prosper under human protection. Those that chose confrontation would discover why the galaxy had once considered humans too dangerous for civilized society. As Boram concluded her address to the assembly, the full scope of the transformation became clear. The galaxy had not lost humanity when they severed ties 2 years earlier. Humanity had lost the galaxy, discovered they could build something better without it, and then returned to reshape galactic civilization according to their own vision. The breath that the galaxy had held for 2 years was finally released, but it came out as an acknowledgement of a new reality rather than relief at returning to the old order. The civilization that emerged from humanity's exile was stronger, more innovative, and more secure than anything that had existed before. But it was also a civilization where humans held ultimate authority and where that authority was based on demonstrated capability rather than ancient precedent. The species that had once dismissed humans as too young and too violent to deserve respect now understood that youth could mean adaptability rather than inexperience, and that violence could be a tool of protection rather than destruction. They had learned that the qualities they had considered flaws were actually the foundation of leadership in a universe that demanded constant vigilance and endless innovation. The new galactic order was not the equal partnership that humanity had originally sought. It was something unprecedented in the history of interstellar civilization, a structure where the youngest species held authority over civilizations that had existed for millennia, where the beings once considered too primitive for membership now determined who deserved protection and who would face the U.